Excellent. Thanks, Marie. Great to be here, Don. Great to chat with you today. Maybe Fireside is a bit too warm, given that maybe spring's peaking up a little bit.
A little bit. We'll kick it up, but I'll leave it over to you guys. Let's continue the discussion and see where we go.
Excellent. So we wanted to chat today about an emerging category of automation solutions, very applicable in the back office and around procurement, which is dealing with unstructured content, a problem that is not new, but has remained a big challenge for really capturing the full spectrum of ROI automation can bring to the table. Don, maybe before we get started, if you could introduce yourself and a bit more on Ashling as well, I'll do the same, and then we could get into this interesting topic.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. Again, my name is Don Sweeney. I'm one of the co-founders of Ashling Partners. We work with organizations to help them improve their efficiency across business processes, primarily by leveraging intelligent automation.
Excellent. And Indico is an automation solution designed to solve unstructured using what some of our customers call a templateless approach to automation, meaning for the first time, we're able to bring an approach that doesn't rely on rules or OCR templating and things like that, which have long been sort of the big impediment to really scaling out unstructured automation solutions. So we recently collaborated with Ashling on a project with Cushman Wakefield and thought it'd be really interesting as sort of both a general discussion around automating unstructured content and maybe some specifics around how these projects come to life and what are customers really looking for when they're tackling these kinds of things. Maybe to start, we'll go from kind of the general to the specific. What have you found as Ashling Partners, as a service provider in this space? What are some of the bigger challenges customers face generally when thinking about automation before we even get into the specifics? What are some of the hurdles they're overcoming when they step into the automation approach?
Sure, thanks, Tom. So I would say the first challenge that companies have is really understanding their process. So having a process mature enough that they understand exactly what people truly do. People think they know what it is, but then what people are actually doing at the detail level are not always aligned. And then really also being able to measure what the business value would be around automating that process tends to also be a challenge.
Now, deployment partners like Ashling have seen very rapid growth in the last 2 to 3 years. Why has this been a successful approach for customers? Why is it not just the software? Why services as well? And what do you sort of attribute your rapid growth to as a service provider in the automation space?
Yeah, it certainly is a hot growth area, as you know as well. But I think the biggest challenge that companies have, and maybe one of the reasons why they would reach out to a firm like ours, is traditionally that was to help them understand that business value, to help them really kind of understand a process. It's now started to pivot more towards help me understand all of the various technologies that people are bringing into this and kind of make sense of it. The technology, companies like yourself, the R&D and the technologies are moving so fast, people can't really keep up with, what couldn't be done a year ago can now be done, or right. Vice versa.
When you think about, automation's become sort of a spectrum of technologies now. It's called different things. Like Gartner's more recently begun to describe the bigger tent over the space as hyperautomation. There are other terminology being used to describe the various components of automation. When you think about unstructured, and we describe it as intelligent process automation as opposed to robotic process automation because of the cognitive ability that's brought to the table when dealing with unstructured. Is IPA really different than RPA? Why not just apply existing RPA technologies to the unstructured problem to document automation?
So great question, and I won't spend a ton of time going back and doing definitions here, but by definition, RPA is really task automation. It's kind of a misleading term. I'm sure you've seen that many times. It's really taking very specific tasks that people do, those mundane, repeatable tasks, and automating it. Now, RPA suites are starting to expand their capabilities, but intelligent process automation, again, by definition, has some form of machine learning or artificial intelligence that's making that smarter and starting to broaden what automation can truly do. And so as you start to think about the difference between IPA and RPA, you're talking about the difference between automating a task and starting to be intelligent enough to automate a broader, full end-to-end process, especially things that may have unstructured data like you mentioned before, or some form of document or email that you have to read and include as part of that process.
What changes have you seen in this category? Are customers really viewing this as something they want to shop for and evaluate separately, because the requirements are so different? What kind of trends have you seen in the last, say, 18 months around, IPA as it's evolved here?
Because it's evolving so fast, it's really a challenge for clients. People need to understand what is the core competency of an organization, and then what is a differentiator for a different organization or software product. And so when you start thinking about intelligent process automation, and you've used the term multiple times now about unstructured data. There's unstructured data, there's semi-structured data, and there's structured data. So without taking too much time here, you think about structured data, that's something that you're pulling out of an application. It's a field on a page within an application, or you're grabbing a cell within Excel or something like that. It's a very, very specific spot that you can automate. That's very simple to automate, and that's where RPA does really, really well. With this being kind of a CPO type group, they probably deal with a lot of purchase orders. That's kind of a semi-structured environment. The same kind of 15 fields are on a purchase order, but they're going to be in a slightly different format from one vendor to another. So that's kind of in essence semi-structured. When you get to unstructured, you're talking about reading a contract or reading a page that might have images on it, or you have to actually get the context of the language around not just a keyword you're looking for. And so the further you get from structured to unstructured, you're really starting to look now into organizations that have specialization in that space versus the ones that are on that more structured side.
And it's not a new problem. Why has this historically been so difficult to solve, especially semi to unstructured? What has been the big impediment to trying to solve this historically?
So the majority of business processes require some form of manipulation of data. I mean, if you think of any kind of process, it's not just take data from X and put it in Y. I mean, that's a lot of kind of data interface type stuff that's probably already been solved. I think as you start to look at any process that the people on this call would have, it's going to be reading emails, reading contracts, reading, maybe even some of the semi-structured data like vendor onboarding forms or something like that. And as you start to kind of take a consolidation of multiple of these, that becomes more challenging, at least historically, to automate. And so you're looking at really bringing in that AI and machine learning component to be able to not just identify the data that you need, but also potentially even the context of that data in which you need.
I had a customer once say this to me, which I thought was almost, just a perfect way to summarize it. They said, "You know what you want, you're not sure what you're going to get," as a way to sort of describe why this is so frustrating at times of a problem. You listed off some of the use cases in the procurement lens. What have you seen as some of the, say, top 3 use cases around unstructured that customers wish they could solve, and are looking to solve?
Yeah, really a lot of the AP processing. I mean, it's not just simple invoice processing. It comes to, are they sending an invoice? Are they sending a credit memo? Are they sending maybe a debit memo payback? There's various things that are all part of that conversation. Are they sending a statement? There's all kinds of different things that they may be requesting. So really automating that whole conversation aspect starts to expand beyond more of a structured or semi-structured environment into a much more unstructured environment. You start thinking about the vendor onboarding and a lot of the compliance components that you need. All of those areas, really kind of end-to-end procure to pay, is typically something that you look at around efficiency and effectiveness. It needs to be done well, but it needs to be done with a minimal total cost of ownership. And so you're really trying to drive a process on moving people away from just doing the data manipulation, data gathering, and more towards data analysis. We really start to pivot the discussion to doing more around vendor scorecards and vendor management, true vendor rating and vendor kind of strategic sourcing versus just spending 90% of your day collecting forms that you know you need to get so the vendors can be compliant in your system.
Yep. I think that, once in a while I get the question of why won't sort of web forms and things like that negate the need, why won't they eliminate this problem? And I think that the biggest source of this challenge is when you're dealing with third-party documents, right? When you're exchanging documents with third parties, because nobody has enough sort of market power to dictate the format, or say, hey, everyone has to use this same document type. And those types of use cases are everywhere and aren't going away anytime soon. And that's really the crux of this, because that's where the unstructured shows up, right? Or semi-structured is when you've got the same type of document, purchase order, invoice, but the variants are, in many ways, invoices I always think of as like snowflakes, right? They're just a million different ways to construct an invoice. And yet every company, has to deal with that as a primary use case, or purchase orders or other supply chain type documentation.
Yeah, Tom, maybe one more example would be things like customs. So anyone who's dealing with kind of international procurement, you say, oh, well, customs forms are standard. Isn't that kind of structured data? You know exactly the form the US government wants. Sure, that one form is, but think of all the supporting documentation that comes with the customs forms. All of that can be a myriad of different items. It's not even the same things every single time. So that's where it starts to become much more context related and unstructured than the actual structured form of the U.S. customs form.
No, it's a great example. It's a common misunderstanding about what unstructured really means. I'll give you an example from the finance world. In mortgage titles and deeds, you would think that, well, a mortgage title is a mortgage title, but then you realize, well, there's 50 states, and in those 50 states, there are 15,000 counties. And so, each of them puts their own little spin on what a title is or a deed. And so and each of those have, 50 supporting document types that go with it. So before you know it, you're in the 100,000 variants of this, what you thought was a very structured, document that any of us could look at and say, oh, that's a title, or that's a deed. But to the machine, those variances are what creates such intense challenges for historically the software to figure it out. When you engage with a customer on these kinds of use cases, how do you try to ensure success? What do you do at the outset to try to set it up for success, given that every customer brings a slightly different flavor of the problem to the table? What are some of the things you guys have done there that you've seen work?
So we always start with the business objectives, right? What are we trying to achieve? We're not implementing technology for the sake of technology, at least hopefully not. We're trying to achieve some form of business outcome. And so we really want to make sure that we're aligning to a business outcome. I previously mentioned the effectiveness and efficiency of things around procure to pay or source to pay. And so typically, that's around continual process improvement metrics, or we try to work with organizations to come up with those continual process improvements, where it could be cost per purchase order or cost per invoice. So a CPI metric is something that quarter over quarter you should be doing better. As you're looking at it from a total cost of ownership, you should be doing it right the first time, so there's not fees in redoing it. But also, even doing it effectively the first time, you want to bring that cost down over time by adding more automation, making it more touchless. You can even provide a better experience by having automated responses and kind of letting people know where you are throughout that process. So we typically try to really focus on that business outcome approach and a continuous process improvement approach.
if we use the sort of Gartner hype cycle metaphor, 2 years ago, you saw a lot of major companies creating centers of excellence around artificial intelligence, and we've seen that kind of wane and go through its trough of disillusionment, I think is the way Gartner describes it. Why is that? What is it about AI that has created this sort of trough of disillusionment, and what do you need to do to sort of overcome that and capture the value of using approaches like Indico that use artificial intelligence to solve the problem?
Yeah, I think too many times people try to jump to the results, right? And so people jumped into machine learning or they jumped into artificial intelligence, and a lot of times they didn't have good data. And so you can't automate something without necessarily having the data for it, especially around machine learning where it's learning every time it's processing from an ongoing basis. So, you and I have worked together on things like resume processing and the machine learning models as it's figuring out, oh, you're accepting these people versus these people. Well, there's positives and negatives to, those concerns around what it's actually learning from the resume and maybe the bias, if you will, on some of those areas. So, you really want to start to first look at what are your objectives and then add the right tool into that objective. I think the other challenge is people walked in with a hammer looking for a nail in some of these. They just said, I need to do machine learning because they came back from a Gartner conference or, whatever. And they maybe weren't necessarily prepared to do that, or they weren't doing it for the right reasons. Where, when we talk about now using that unstructured data, you're bringing in the right tools to process unstructured data and in essence make it structured, right? To then be able to then manipulate that data or automate that or then carry it along further along the process. So I think people are starting to figure that out, but that's certainly been the challenges that we've seen to date.
Yeah, I think, and this is where I think RPA and IPA are very, very compatible, where if you can turn unstructured into structure, then you have platforms surrounding it that are already optimized for structured data and are really good at it, like RPA, like BPM, like business intelligence, like CRM, where implicitly those platforms assume you're going to feed them structure. And if you do, they work brilliantly, right? They're designed to do that. And so that's sort of the crux of it is where you can turn unstructured into structure, you kind of unlocked its value. Absolutely. What are some of when you look forward from what you hear from customers and where you guys are trying to sort of push the thinking with your customers, what are some of the key trends that you're seeing, whether it's things like citizen data science, low code, what kind of things is high on your radar that you're keeping careful track of?
Yeah, it's really all of what you just said, Tom. So we're certainly seeing people wanting to bring this in-house and empower their users. So, think about, and I'm dating myself here a little bit, but think about work pre-Excel, right? Pre-Microsoft Office. You had to actually have people who could go do spreadsheets before they were true spreadsheets. And Excel empowered the actual user to now be able to do a lot of their own data manipulation and own calculations. And everybody knows how to use Excel, or 99% of people know how to use Excel. You're starting to see that a little bit in the low code side and in that citizen data scientist side. You're starting to see really that empowerment of the end user. And kind of what we see is people having these Lego blocks, if you will. So kind of pre-built components. So not everybody's going to start with a clean sheet of paper and write their own code, nor should they. But as things are kind of pre-built, then you'll be able to kind of grab those and assemble them together for an automated process that you're looking for. So Indico may provide a resume processing, or it may provide a reading of contracts, or you talked about even lease extraction and some of those other items, loans and other financial services items that are contract reads. So those might be in essence a component into a larger automation where my automation might be slightly different than yours and might be slightly different than somebody else's on the call here. But I've got these components that I can then use and personalize. We really think that's where the puck is heading, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. I see a question from the audience that I think is relevant here. The questions around maybe on a specific customer experience you've had. How do they try to calculate the ROI for this kind of investment? As specifically as you can answer as possible. How do customers think about, if they're going to turn around and ask management to spend this money on services and software? How have you seen ROI be characterized?
So I'll give you the very fast version here. So we really try to take processes and put them into two buckets. For the sake of this, we're going to call it core and differentiated. So a differentiated process is typically things where you are measuring more about experience and other value-added metrics. So employee engagement might be something on the experience side, or customer experience might be something. So you're measuring ROI very different in those than you would core. So core, like procurement, things like that, we talk about efficiency and effectiveness. That's typically measured by hours back to the business. So what are we freeing up to allow them to go do other things? And so that's a hard dollar ROI, typically hours back to the business based on cost of the individual. And you're literally measuring it by, okay, how many hours do I no longer have to spend by reading contracts, extrapolating the data and entering that data into a contracts module, or reading resumes and sorting the resumes to be the top 10 that I'm going to now go give to another person, or doing 3D modeling, or whatever the case may be, that are these more significant, more meaningful items. From a core side, you're typically talking about hours saved or hours back to the business.
And this one I see is a little bit related. How do you set expectations around what's a realistic time to first value when engaging on an unstructured use case? What do you have a way you think about that with customers when it's sort of they're trying to dimension how long will it take me to see kind of first value?
Yeah, I mean, that's something that we certainly work on with every client. Not only just their first engagement, but all engagements, is we're really sitting down and kind of building that business case of what is the value, what's that business outcome that I mentioned, and then on the flip side of that, what's the feasibility or effort that it's going to take to automate? How much of this can you truly automate? Is it 70%, 40%, 90%? And you start to actually build a business case. I think a lot of times you're really trying to sit down and figure out what is that business case, and then part of that, how long is it? There's not a right or wrong answer. Some try to have a really big business case first. Others look for really small business cases, and they want that frequency of kind of momentum. Again, not a right or wrong model, but certainly people kind of look at it from different approaches.
This question's a little bit more technical. Let me paraphrase a bit for our discussion here. The question's around challenges with training data as it relates to artificial intelligence, and where I think the question's had some seasoned projects fail on that basis in the past. How have you guys approached the sort of training data problem as it relates to AI? And I can certainly weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, I'm sure you're going to weigh in on this one, Tom. So you absolutely need to make sure you have a good data set that you are using for training purposes. And you want to make sure that that is as broad as possible. You talked about, when you first mentioned Indico, you were talking about kind of a templateless driven model. There are certainly organizations, kind of the old school way of doing, some of this is, I want 10 copies from each vendor, and I'm going to train it, by vendor, and you're in essence kind of training it in a template-based model. Now you really want as many diverse options as possible, because you're really now training it for the fields and extrapolating it more from a field-based model. So you really want a high volume, call it 500. I'm sure you're going to say it could be significantly more than that, depending on the use case, of course, but you're going to want like 500 items that are pretty diverse that you can use to train that model.
Yeah, and I think, in the case of Indico, one of the big breakthroughs we think we've brought to the market is, instead of historically with machine learning, you might need 100,000 labeled samples to get any kind of efficacy. With Indico, you're in that sort of 200 to 500, labeled samples range to build a custom model to interpret a particular type of document, be it type of purchase order, a type of contract, with a specific sort of structure that you're hoping to extract from it. I think the corollary to that also is we've seen a fair amount of questions more recently around bias when it comes to AI. And I don't mean specifically just bias in terms of social bias, but a model biased to make a type of decisions versus another type of decisions. And so I think what we always preach is, AI is still very much an intelligent parrot, is the way I like to describe it, right? It'll parrot back what you tell it. And so if you train it with biased data, either, for example, biased towards a certain flavor of document types versus another, it will tend to, predict and lean towards the majority of the training data you've given it. And so you need two things there. You need a diversity of training data, and you need the ability to explain how these models are working, with an interface that gives you that level of detail, which again, I think is something that we are strong believers in, that this notion that AI has to be a black box is something that we kind of reject. And we don't think ultimately the enterprise can stomach that. I don't know if you've experienced some of that more recently with AI, if you've had customers ask questions around governance and explainability.
Yeah, absolutely. No question. It's like you said, AI is really a parrot. It's going to do exactly what you ask it to do. It's just going to do it over and over and over again, and kind of learn based on what you're telling it are good results. So you really want to make sure you've got a diverse set of data there.
Yeah, I think that ML ops or AI governance, it's called different things, is one of the bigger trends for 2021 and going forward. That and you're seeing it in the general public as well. Things like, how does YouTube make recommendations around videos? How does a Tesla make its decisions around self-driving? As a society, understanding AI explainability is critical, and certainly in regulated industries like finance and accounting and insurance, that level of transparency is required, right? Because of the regulatory impacts that come into play when you're dealing with automation. Well, I think we just have 1 minute left here. So maybe lastly, any broad lessons learned from these kinds of technologies? If you're going to kind of give, your wrap up, what are your 3 bullets in terms of takeaways, in terms of setting yourself up for success you would give folks on the call based on your experience with the unstructured category?
Yeah, so certainly understand what the business value is. Hopefully that came across pretty loud and clear in this conversation. Make sure you have a business objective before you do it just for the sake of doing it. Make sure you think about specialists when it comes to the areas that you need specialists in that technology or tool set. And unstructured is certainly an example of that.
Yeah.
And then make sure you've got an understanding, a good use case, good test data, and kind of really think through the process of what success is, right? So I think at a fast version, that'll be the wrap here for me.
Yeah, and from our perspective as sort of a vendor, I think working with an Ashling Partners, because they're seeing these challenges over and over again, your learning curve gets to basically jump to the very bottom there, because you get to take advantage of all the great learnings that Ashling's had in the market and how to deploy these things and how to be successful. Well, it's been great, Don. I really appreciate the chat here. Great level of detail on tackling this emerging category, which I think offers such a tremendous amount of potential value in the procurement arena.
Yeah, always great speaking with you, Tom.
Great. All right, Marie, we'll turn it back to you.
Thank you guys so much for sharing that. I think a lot of it has flown into some of the conversations we've had today, and actually our session up next, when we're looking at what does a technology-centric procurement team look like. We think data is going to be a big leading effort forward in making procurement a catalyst in change and innovation, and it will continue to help us be strategic sourcers. So Don, Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to have that chat with us.
Great.
Yeah, have
Thanks
a great day. Thanks for having us.